Little House on the Prairie, among the most popular American television shows during the 1970s, drew from the TV Western but emphasized family and community building rather than masculine action and conquering the wilderness. A product of 1970s social and economic anxieties, the program constructed Caroline and Charles Ingalls as catalysts for a hoped-for restoration of the American family and civil society in the wake of 1960s conflicts. Diegetic music making, from Charles's fiddle playing to congregational hymn singing to town dances and brass band performances, built and rebuilt community even as the musical Ingalls worked to re-knit the social and moral fabric of Walnut Grove, Minnesota. I originally intended to discuss the program's diegetic and non-diegetic music. Based on feedback on an earlier version of this paper, and given the sheer amount of music that occurs over the program's 9 seasons, for today I'll be focusing on diegetic performances of sacred music. After considering how this type of music is treated differently on television and in the novels by Laura Ingalls Wilder, I'll connect my musical observations to the central role of Charles and Caroline within the television program's moral universe. Laura Ingalls Wilder's novels, from Little House in the Big Woods of 1932 to These Happy Golden Years of 1943, follow the Ingalls family as they move from Wisconsin's Big Woods to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, and finally to De Smet, South Dakota. In each novel, the Ingalls' home is filled with fiddling, singing, and dancing. At the same time, with each relocation, the Ingalls join increasingly larger, more settled communities, and Wilder places more robust music making in expanding social contexts. Thus, as De Smet booms, growing larger than Walnut Grove, public music making expands outward from home to church services, Sunday schools, and revival meetings, and finally to public entertainments. The public entertainments include a series of Friday night literaries, which Charles Ingalls helped to organize and in which he performed regularly, and a singing school that Laura and Almanzo Wilder attended while courting. Wilder spends much time describing the literaries and singing school, but only references, and does not linger on, the use of organ music in church services at the same time in her narrative. In contrast to the novels, television's Little House stays firmly situated in Walnut Grove, except for 2 collections of episodes at the end of Season 3 and the beginning of Season 5, when the Ingalls briefly relocate to Dakota Territory and then return to Walnut Grove. Because of the more settled nature of its Ingalls family, the television series lacks the gradual expansion of community-based music making that emerges across Wilder's novels. Over the course of Wilder's 7 novels that focus on the Ingalls family, there are 179 musical events. These range from brief references to music making in which Wilder notes Pa plays the fiddle, sings, or leads a family dance, to moments when Wilder has Charles or Laura sing a specific song, gives its title, and may transcribe its lyrics in the text, to Wilder's extended recounting of musical evenings for which she lists multiple pieces by title that Charles plays or sings. I have counted each musical title provided by Wilder as an individual musical event, even for those times in the narrative when multiple pieces of music are played or sung during a single music-making session. This overcounts music-making sessions across the novels, but at the same time the novels occasionally indicate that, for example, every Sunday Pa played and the family sang, or there were numerous glorious winter days with evenings of music and singing and dancing. Because we cannot know exactly how many other such winter days or nights within the narrative universe of the novels included music, I have counted each occurrence of those kinds of passages as only a single musical event. This undercounts musical sessions that are implied to have occurred within the novel's narrative universe. Of the 179 musical events in Wilder's novels, 145, or 81%, are titles of pieces played, sung, or danced, thus offering insight into the repertoire most familiar to the Ingalls during the 1870s and early 1880s. 123 of these 179 events, or 69%, occur in the home, with Charles leading. This domestic repertoire is predominantly secular. O Susanna, My Old Kentucky Home, and 3 Blind Mice are examples. Another, Old Dan Tucker, is used prominently in both diegetic and non-diegetic registers on the television series in connection to Mr. Edwards. The Ingalls also play and sing folk songs, Union and Confederate Civil War songs, and Scottish songs, marches, and jigs. The television series maintains the importance of music making for the Ingalls family, and Michael Landon's Charles Ingalls is the series' preeminent musician, mirroring his role in Wilder's novels. Nevertheless, Landon's Charles does not play the fiddle on screen with the regularity that Pa plays in the novels. And unlike the novel's Pa, Landon's Charles rarely sings secular songs. Several factors may account for this change. Narrative pacing tends to slow down more for diegetic singing than for diegetic instrumental music, which more easily accommodates layering of other storytelling elements over it. And there had been substantive changes in attitudes toward men singing between 1880 and 1970. Thus, Charles and other men occasionally sing while working in Wilder's novels, but this never happens on television. More significantly, the television series includes many incidences of diegetic music making, but it changes social contexts of performances, repertoire performed, and principal participants in comparison to the novels. For example, domestic music making does not make up as large a percentage of the total number of diegetic musical moments seen or heard on the television series. Instead, the series expands the kinds of public places in which diegetic music making occurs and the types of music heard. Small wind bands appear on screen or are heard about 10 times across the series. More public dances are depicted. Music also emanates from saloons when the Ingalls are uprooted to the Dakota Territory and when they pass near such establishments in Sleepy Eye or Mankato. We also hear a rendition of Mendelssohn's Wedding March played on the accordion by one of Mary Ingalls' students during her wedding in Season 5, and organ music during the prelude before Hester Sue Terhune's wedding in Season 7. None of these musical contexts or kinds of music, certainly not the saloon music, are included in Wilder's soundscape. Yet television viewers hear these additional kinds of diegetic public musical moments because members of the Ingalls family are close by, at work building community or repairing the social fabric in a broader range of contexts than those featured in Wilder's novels. Much of the diegetic music making on television remains in the background, but like the non-diegetic cues, some diegetic music reinforces plot or thematic emphases, including the series' anachronistic representation of women's public, social, and economic roles. As television's Little House adds saloon and wind band music, it also forgoes depicting the 19th century entertainments on which Wilder dwells in her late novels. Instead, it focuses on music making in church services, increasing the importance of diegetic music in the church relative to the number of references to music in church services in Wilder's novels. In addition to the 123 references to secular music making in the Ingalls' various homes in the novels, Wilder refers to domestic singing of sacred music 20 times, but only makes 9 references to singing in a formal worship service in a church. Contrarily, the Ingalls are not shown attending church on every episode of the television series, but they do appear in church more than 9 times in 9 seasons. Furthermore, on the television series, and unlike in the novels, diegetic singing of sacred music only occurs in the context of public religious services, including funerals and weddings, with 2 exceptions, both connected to Hester Sue Terhune, whom I will discuss in a moment. Indeed, the singing of hymns in church services and of Old Dan Tucker by Mr. Edwards accounts for most of the diegetic singing in the series. The other occurrences include the singing of several secular songs in The Collection from Season 3, on which Johnny Cash guest starred, 2 scenes when Mary and Laura Ingalls sing at home, and 3 when children from the blind school sing. The near-exclusive placement of sacred music in public worship contexts parallels the television series' tendency to make church a more critical site of personal growth than it serves in Wilder's novels, and may reflect the general upsurge in interest in religious belief and practice in the 1970s across a range of America's political and social landscape, as described by historian Bruce Schulman. The sacred repertoires sung in religious services in Wilder's novels and on television also differ from each other. Table 2 lists the entire sacred repertoire sung publicly in Wilder's novels. Table 3 lists the hymns sung in public worship on the television series, plus a handful of other sacred pieces sung outside of the church or public worship services. I suggest a simple explanation for these differences. The repertoire of 19th century hymnody featured on television was still being sung in American Protestant denominations during the 1970s, though less so since the 1980s and the shift in American Protestant worship to less hymnody and more praise music. One or more members of the Ingalls family are present in all of the television series' church services. In 2 instances, Charles has just engaged in an extraordinary act of community restoration before the singing commences. In Gold Country, Season 3's multi-episode finale, he single-handedly buries the remains of the elderly prospector, Zachariah, who committed suicide by self-immolation after his wife's grave was tampered with by gold seekers. And Charles also reburies the wife's remains. He then returns to Newton for the Frontier Church's Wednesday evening service as the congregation sings, "Shall We Gather at the River?" After the hymn, the pastor asks Charles to testify to the congregation, which he does. Having been changed by his grisly work in the prior scene, Charles offers a fairly strong rejection of greed and announces he's decided to pull his family out of Newton. In Harriet's Happenings from Season 5, he confronts Mrs. Olson and her cousin, newspaperman Sterling Murdoch, during church as he preaches against gossiping and the congregation members' love of gossip. Charles then leads the Walnut Grove congregation in "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." These musical dramatic moments strengthen Charles's central role within the television program's moral system. Equally important are newly fashioned moments on television in which women function as the primary musicians and leaders. Much of Season 4, which is more violent than the first 3 seasons, focuses on Mary Ingalls. Whisper Country, the 15th episode, features an important woman-led sacred music scene. During the episode, Mary encounters a community even more socially and religiously conservative than her family when she takes a position as a teacher in the remote village of Willow Prairie, Minnesota. As tensions increase, Miss Peel, the self-appointed but profoundly ignorant spiritual matriarch of the village, brands Mary as Jezebel for supposedly trying to seduce Joshua, one of the community's youth. The episode's conclusion draws together music, morality, and community reformation. After having given up and gone home at the episode's midpoint, Mary returns to Willow Prairie and fights ignorance of the Bible, including ignorance of the actual content of the 10 Commandments, with her superior knowledge based on years of reading and memorizing the good book. In the midst of a Sunday morning service, Mary's arguments about the meaning of the 10 Commandments silence Miss Peel. Mary then preaches from Psalm 133, of the goodness of God's creation and the goodness of people living in unity, and the goodness of learning. By now, Joshua's mother has publicly called out her husband for bearing false witness against Mary. With Mary's preaching of Psalm 133, Ellen Fisher, the mother of the family with whom Mary had boarded, says, "Amen." She repeats "Amen" when Mary says that school will be open again the next day, then rises and starts singing, "Jesus loves me, this I know." Gradually, all join in. Mary offers her hand to Miss Peel, who takes it. Non-diegetic organ music then begins to accompany the diegetic singing. As the hymn's second stanza starts, strings are added, eventually crescendoing into the conclusion of the episode. In this scene, a young woman preaches, inspiring other women to claim moral leadership of their community and to lead out in song to affirm their new moral and communal vision. Although Wilder depicts both men and women participating in communal music making in De Smet, including in church services, her novels emphasize male performers. This scene in Whisper Country did not, and probably would not, occur in Wilder's novels. Hester Sue Terhune, portrayed by Ketty Lester, the teacher and school administrator who joins Adam Kendall and Mary Ingalls in running the School for the Blind when it relocates to Walnut Grove, is the principal female performer and leader of sacred music on the television series. She and Joe Kagan are also the only 2 recurring African-American characters on the series. Neither appears in Wilder's novels. Hester Sue sings Rock of Ages several times in different styles in religious services in Walnut Grove, but is also shown leading the School for the Blind's student choir in several gospel songs, including Go Tell It on the Mountain, during the Season 7 episode Make a Joyful Noise. In the Season 8 Christmas special, she alone sings a solo, a shortened version of Sweet Little Jesus Boy, which was not written until the 1930s.
Sweet little Jesus boy, we didn't know.
Hester Sue's musical elevation was a good use of Lester's talents, but also represents a substantive transformation of the representation of race, religion, and performance relative to the source materials for Little House on the Prairie. Similarly potent moments of diegetic music-making never emerge around Caroline Ingalls. Nevertheless, she is repeatedly shown wielding moral and social authority in Walnut Grove. This begins with her leadership of circles of women and resistance to Harriet Olsen's bullying, expands to denunciation of male behavior causing social fragmentation during the first season, and reaches a peak in the Season 4 episode Freedom Flight from 1977, in which Charles and Caroline provide shelter to a Native American chief, his son, and his grandchildren, seeking medical assistance while being hunted by hostile townsfolk and cavalry troopers for leaving their reservation. While Charles and Doc Baker escort the native family back into the prairie, the racist Mr. McGregor, leader of a bloodthirsty Walnut Grove posse, threatens Caroline in her own home for information. She resists and warns him to prepare for her own violent response if he dares to touch her. The episode ends with the Native Americans safely away into the hills as Charles confronts McGregor, his men, and a cavalry platoon. Indianist musical tropes appear in this episode, but Freedom Flight also incorporates Native American singing, including in the visually and musically haunting final seconds. We see the burning funeral pyre of the native chief, yet hear him singing in a ghostly non-diegetic register just before the closing credits' extra diegetic music begins. Freedom Flight is the culmination of a series of episodes in which Caroline repeatedly welcomes and cares for minority characters, misfits, and others unwelcomed by the majority of Walnut Grove's citizens. These include Solomon, an African-American runaway, and Spotted Eagle, a Native American boy shunned by nearly everyone in town. In later seasons, Caroline and Charles embrace Hester Sue and Joe, welcoming them into the Walnut Grove Church against the opposition of Harriet Olsen and the racist and ultimately violent Judd Larrabee. Through these actions, television's Caroline departs significantly from Wilder's Ma, who repeatedly expresses hatred for Indians in the novels. Hester Sue's musical and dramatic importance, the sympathetic treatment of Native Americans, and Caroline's commitment to racial peace are consistent with broader social and cultural trends in 1970s America. As Porter notes, the 1970s were nothing less than a critical moment in the world historical development of race as a social, political, and cultural category. This was evident in many ways, but in the media, increasing visibility of racial or ethnic images signaled, quote, growing visibility and power of ethnic and racial groups and a wider interest in cultural difference as a social value, end quote. It may be fruitful to read Charles and Caroline's empathy for and support of Native American characters against the backdrop of the rise of the American Indian movement, its occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, and its Longest Walk of 1978. Furthermore, the writer's attention to issues of race, inclusion, and justice feels intentional. In the opening minutes of Blind Journey Part 1 from Season 5, Nels and Harriet Olsen debate welcoming Joe Kagan into the Walnut Grove Church. Here and in later scenes, questions about race, national identity, American citizenship, and the meaning of John 3:16 are implicitly and explicitly considered, with Nels at one point referring to Harriet's perspective as, quote, hate propaganda. Wilder's novels offer no precedent for this. But we should widen the lens. During the 1970s, Americans were also caught up in public debates about the roles of men and women, gender, and sexuality, which also filled the media. Furthermore, these debates occurred during an extended economic crisis that undermined faith in American power and prosperity at precisely the moment when more women were entering higher education and the national job market. Television's Little House on the Prairie foregrounded those economic changes, too. Caroline, Hester Sue, and Mary are all working women, in contrast to characterizations in Wilder's novels, and each contributes to the social and moral well-being of Walnut Grove, Sleepy Eye, and other Minnesota communities. It seems inevitable, then, that the television series would also depict women preaching and leading sacred singing in public religious services, even though men led sacred musical performances in Laura Ingalls Wilder's early 20th century novels. But even in the context of all the social and economic changes occurring in 1970s America, women's public leadership in Protestant worship and church governance remained a radical notion, and, indeed, continues to be less common even in mainline denominations today. In that sense, Caroline Ingalls and Hester Sue Terhune remain pioneers in a frontier whose promise remains only partially fulfilled.